In June of 1839, in the low, humid heat of Natchez, Mississippi, Eleanor Whitcomb made an announcement that stunned even the most hardened plantation families along the river. After 14 years of a barren marriage, the mistress of Willowmere Plantation declared herself with child. Doctors had sworn it impossible. Priests had whispered it was God's judgment. Her husband, Thomas Whitcomb, had already arranged his estate as if no heir would ever come. Yet by February of the following year, Eleanor's body told a different story. Her belly grew. Servants counted the weeks. Neighbors watched. And one enslaved woman, a quiet seamstress named Ruth, was abruptly removed from the quarters and locked away in the unused carriage house. The white society of Natchez celebrated the miracle. What they did not know was that the child growing within Eleanor was not hers. By 1854, that child would inherit land, slaves, and a family name worth thousands of dollars. By then Ruth would be dead. And by then 15 years of lies would be buried beneath wills, marriages, and blood. What really happened inside Willowmere Plantation? What bargain did an infertile mistress strike that terrified everyone who later uncovered it? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment your state below. Now let me take you back to where it all began. In the summer of 1825, Willowmere Plantation sat heavy and silent along the eastern bend of the Mississippi River, its white-pillared house rising from the cotton fields like a monument built for something already dead. The land was rich, the soil dark and forgiving, the river generous. Everything here produced. Everything, that is, except an heir. Eleanor Whitcomb knew this before anyone spoke it aloud. She had known it in the careful pauses of visiting physicians, in the way their fingers lingered too long on her wrist while they counted, recounted, then abandoned her pulse. She had known it in the prayers whispered at night beside Thomas's sleeping body, prayers that returned unanswered, night after night, year after year. 14 years of marriage had passed. 14 summers of watching other women swell with life. 14 winters of pretending she did not hear the laughter behind fans at church. "You must not distress yourself, Mrs. Whitcomb," one doctor had said gently, his leather bag already in hand. "Sometimes the Lord withholds for reasons beyond medicine." Another had been less kind. "Your constitution is delicate." Delicate. Eleanor had tasted the word like bitterness on her tongue. Her body was strong enough to endure bleeding, purging, fasting, tonics that burned the throat and emptied the stomach. Strong enough to endure humiliation. But not strong enough, it seemed, to do the one thing a woman of her station existed to do. Above her, Spanish moss draped itself from the live oaks, gray and funereal, swaying with every breath of humid air. Willowmere always smelled of heat and damp earth, of cotton bowls split open under the sun, of iron and sweat and old wood. It was the smell of wealth. It was the smell of permanence. Thomas Whitcomb loved permanence. He was not unkind, not in the way men were whispered about at market or hinted at during visits from Charleston relatives. He did not strike her. He did not shout. He did something far worse. He withdrew. He folded himself into ledgers and land maps, into inventory lists and shipping schedules, into a future that did not require her participation. "We must consider alternatives," he had said one evening, staring at the fire rather than at her. "Contingencies." Alternatives to what? Eleanor asked, though she already knew. To the absence of an heir. The word absence echoed through her like a hollow room. From that night on, Eleanor began to notice things she had not noticed before. Or perhaps she had noticed them, and only now allowed herself to think about them. She noticed the enslaved women more carefully, their hips, their bellies, the way life came to them with cruel ease. She noticed how often the overseer recorded births in his neat hand, how quickly the quarters filled with the sounds of infants. She noticed how the plantation functioned like a body that rejected her, producing everywhere except where she stood. Ruth moved quietly through this world. She was 22 that year, born on Willowmere, light-boned and straight-backed, with eyes that absorbed more than they revealed. She worked as a seamstress in the main house, her fingers quick and precise, repairing hems, altering dresses, mending lace Eleanor pretended not to notice unraveling. Ruth spoke little unless spoken to. When she did, her voice was soft, measured. "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am." Nothing more. What Eleanor did not know, not yet, was that Ruth could read. She had learned years earlier, from an old book left behind by Thomas's deceased father, stolen moments tracing letters by candlelight in the quarters. She could write too, though she rarely dared. Knowledge, for someone like her, was both weapon and danger. Eleanor watched Ruth without understanding why. Watched the way she stood patiently during fittings, the way her breathing remained steady even when Eleanor's voice sharpened. watched the curve of her neck, the strength in her hands. "You are healthy," Eleanor said once, abruptly. Ruth paused. "Yes, ma'am." "You have never been ill?" "No, ma'am." Eleanor nodded, as if confirming a calculation only she could see. The house itself seemed to conspire with her thoughts. Hallways carried whispers. Floorboards remembered footsteps. Upstairs, the nursery, prepared once, then locked away, gathered dust beneath embroidered curtains yellowing with age. Eleanor passed its door every day. She never opened it. None of them knew, not Thomas with his ledgers, not the servants who avoided Eleanor's gaze, not even Ruth herself, that something had shifted inside the mistress of Willowmere. By autumn, Eleanor had begun keeping a journal again. Not prayers. Not confessions. Lists. Dates. Cycles. Observations. By winter, she had stopped attending church regularly. By spring, she had made a decision that would alter every life on that plantation. And Ruth, stitching quietly near the window, unaware of the future closing around her, was already at the center of it. What Eleanor was planning did not feel to her like cruelty. It felt like survival. Ruth had learned early that invisibility was not the same as safety, but it was often the closest thing an enslaved woman could afford. She moved through Willowmere with the controlled grace of someone who understood exactly how quickly a gaze could become a chain. In the mornings, she carried folded linens to the upper rooms. By noon, she sat near the tall parlor windows with needle and thread, mending the delicate collars Thomas preferred and altering Eleanor's dresses so they could continue pretending time did not touch her. In the evenings, when the lamps were lit and the air grew thick with river heat, she carried finished garments back to the wardrobe room and shut the door quietly behind her, as though sound itself could be punished. The quarters spoke of her in two ways. Some said she had been spared because she was house, as if the walls of the big home could soften the laws of ownership. Others said the opposite, that housework only meant you were closer to the eyes that could destroy you. Ruth never corrected anyone. She did not offer stories. She did not invite curiosity. But she had a history all the same. Her mother, Lydia, had died when Ruth was 13, taken by fever in the same week the cotton fields flooded and the river swallowed 3 small cabins at the edge of the property. Ruth remembered that week in sharp fragments. The mud sucking at bare feet, the smell of rot and river weeds, the sound of men shouting orders while women dragged children out of rising water. And then the silence when her mother's coughing stopped. No funeral. No headstone. Only a hurried burial beyond the line of pecan trees where the enslaved dead were laid like forgotten tools. After that, Ruth became useful in a different way. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were sharp. She could follow patterns and measure cloth without wasting. She learned quickly, and the older seamstress, Aunt Millie, who was not her aunt but might as well have been, took her under her wing. "Your hands keep you alive," Millie told her one night, pressing a needle into her palm like a sacred object. "Not your tears. Not your prayers. Your hands." So Ruth became careful. And her carefulness made her valuable. That was why she worked upstairs. That was why she stood in Eleanor Whitcomb's presence almost daily and yet remained, in the mistress's mind, something less than fully human, until Eleanor's barrenness began to turn her gaze into something sharper. Ruth felt that gaze even when Eleanor said nothing. At first it was small. A pause too long when Ruth tightened a ribbon. A glance that lingered at Ruth's waist, her hips, the subtle swell of muscle in her arms. Then it became more direct. Eleanor's questions asked as if they were casual and yet delivered like probes. "How old are you again?" 22, ma'am." "And you have not had children?" Ruth's fingers had stilled on a hem. She kept her eyes down. "No, ma'am." Eleanor's lips tightened as if disappointment was a personal insult. But then she nodded, satisfied by the answer in a way Ruth could not understand. What Ruth did understand was danger. Because a mistress did not ask questions like that without a reason. And beneath the reason, beneath the calm tone and the finely pressed dresses, there was always the same truth. Ruth's body did not belong to her. That truth lived everywhere at Willowmere. It lived in the slave codes posted at the courthouse in Natchez. It lived in the overseer's ledger where births were recorded beside acreage and mules, as if babies and animals were measured by the same ink. It lived in the way men spoke when they thought no white woman was listening. Ruth had heard enough to know what happened to girls who were noticed, so she worked harder to become smaller. She did not look at Thomas Whitcomb directly unless she had to. She did not linger in doorways. She did not speak unless spoken to. She made herself a shadow. Yet shadows could be called into the light whenever the owner wished. And Eleanor, in those months, seemed to be drawing Ruth toward that light like a slow, inevitable tide. It was not affection. Ruth knew the difference. Eleanor did not smile at her the way a kind woman might. Eleanor's interest was cold, measuring, like a merchant inspecting goods. One afternoon, Eleanor called her into the wardrobe room. The air in there smelled of lavender sachets and old silk, but beneath it was another scent, the sharpness of metal from the lock on the door recently oiled. Ruth noticed it immediately. Eleanor stood before the mirror, half-dressed, her corset unlaced. Her hair was pinned up but uneven, as if she had been pulling at it. Her reflection looked like a woman trying to keep herself from cracking apart. "Close the door," Eleanor said. Ruth did. The sound of the latch settling into place was soft. Final. Eleanor watched her in the mirror. "Come nearer." Ruth stepped forward, careful. The floorboards creaked beneath her, and she hated that sound. It announced her presence too loudly. Eleanor held out the corset strings. "Tighten it." Ruth took the strings and pulled, slow at first, then firmer, drawing the fabric tight around Eleanor's waist. "Harder," Eleanor said. Ruth obeyed. Eleanor's breath hitched. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the dressing table. "There," Eleanor murmured, as if the pain was proof of something. "If I cannot make my body do what it must, I will make it look as though it did." Ruth froze. She did not understand the full meaning, but the words curled in her mind like smoke. Eleanor turned then, finally facing her. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with an intensity that looked almost like hunger. "You are discreet," Eleanor said. Ruth forced her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am." "You do what you are told." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor stepped closer, so close Ruth could smell her. Rosewater, sweat, and something else underneath, something bitter like fear. "Good," Eleanor whispered, "because there are things coming that you will not speak of. Not to anyone." Ruth's pulse hammered in her throat. She wanted to ask what things. She wanted to run. But her feet did not move, because she already knew the rule of Willowmere. When the mistress said coming, it meant the future had already been decided. And Ruth, the woman no one saw, was about to become the secret everyone lived on. The first night Eleanor summoned Ruth after supper, the house was unnaturally quiet. The river wind had died, leaving the air thick and unmoving, as though Willowmere itself were holding its breath. Thomas had retired early with his account books, the steady scratch of his pen fading as Ruth passed the study door. The other servants had been dismissed. Lamps were turned low. Shadows clung to the walls like damp cloth. Ruth was told to bring fresh linens to the west wing. She knew that wing well. Everyone did. It had not been used in years. The rooms there still smelled faintly of cedar and disuse, of furniture that remembered bodies no longer present. A carriage house sat just beyond it, attached but separate, once meant for guests who overstayed their welcome or relatives who arrived with inconvenient habits. Eleanor was waiting inside. She had changed into a plain house dress, unadorned, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way Ruth had never seen before. No jewelry. No stays. Just a woman standing alone in lamplight, her face drawn tight with resolve. "Set them there," Eleanor said, nodding toward the bed. Ruth obeyed. Her hands shook despite her effort to still them. "You will stay," Eleanor added. The words fell like a lock turning. Ruth stood at the foot of the bed, eyes lowered. She could hear her own breathing loud in the silence. Eleanor studied her openly now. There was no pretense left, no polite questions. She circled Ruth slowly as if inspecting cloth before purchase. "You are strong," Eleanor said. "Healthy. You do not drink. You have not borne children." Ruth's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am. That is important." Eleanor stopped in front of her. "You understand why?" Ruth swallowed. "I reckon. Because children make women weak sometimes." Eleanor almost smiled. "You're wrong. Children prove a woman works." The words burned. Eleanor turned away, walking toward the window, her hands clasped behind her back. Outside, the moonlight cut across the cotton fields in pale stripes, the plants standing in obedient rows. "I have done everything required of me," Eleanor said. "I married well. I kept house. I prayed. I endured the indignity of doctors and the whispers of other women who pretend sympathy while counting the years of my failure." She turned sharply. "And yet I have nothing to show for it." Ruth did not respond. She knew better. Eleanor stepped closer again, close enough that Ruth could see the faint lines around her eyes, the exhaustion etched into her face. "I will not be replaced," Eleanor said quietly. "I will not be pitted. And I will not die knowing everything I built passes to some distant cousin who has never set foot on this land." Her voice hardened. "So I have decided upon a solution." Ruth's stomach twisted. She already knew what was coming. She had known since the first question Eleanor ever asked her. No one will be harmed, Eleanor continued, as if harm were a matter of opinion. You will be cared for. Protected. This house will provide everything you require. Ruth's voice emerged before she could stop it. Ma'am, I ain't done nothing. Eleanor's eyes flashed. This is not punishment. Then what is it? Eleanor hesitated. Just for a moment. Then she spoke the words as if saying them plainly would make them less monstrous. You will bear a child. The room seemed to tilt. Ruth took a step back before she could stop herself. Her heel struck the edge of the bed. No, she said, the word sharp and sudden. Eleanor's face hardened instantly. You will. Ruth's hands curled into fists at her sides. I can't. I won't. Eleanor moved fast then, faster than Ruth expected, seizing her wrist with surprising strength. You misunderstand, Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. This is not a request. Ruth yanked her arm back, heart pounding. Please, ma'am. Do not beg, Eleanor snapped. I have already considered everything. Considered what? That the child will be mine. That no one will ever know the truth. That your role in this will never be spoken of. Ruth's breath came in short gasps. It ain't right. Right? Eleanor laughed softly, bitterly. Nothing about this world is right. Not for me. Not for you. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. But you will survive this. And survival, Ruth, is more than most of your kind are given. The word struck like a slap. Ruth felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear alone, but understanding. This was already decided. She glanced toward the door, toward freedom that was not real. Eleanor followed her gaze and smiled thinly. You will not leave Willowmere, Eleanor said. Not until this is done. Ruth's voice trembled. And if I refuse? Eleanor's eyes did not blink. Then I will make your life very difficult. I will sell you south. I will sell your people with you. I will erase what little safety you have earned here. She stepped back, letting the threat breathe. Or, Eleanor added almost gently, you can do this one thing. And afterward you will live. What? The word meant nothing without freedom, but Ruth understood its power. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. What he did not know, the narrator would later say, was that Thomas Whitcomb had already agreed to Eleanor's plan. But Ruth did not know that yet. All she knew was that the mistress of Willowmere was watching her, waiting. And that the future of the plantation, of bloodlines, wealth, and lies, rested on the answer of a woman who had never been allowed to choose. Ruth lowered her eyes. Yes, ma'am, she whispered. And with those words the conspiracy began. By the following week, Ruth no longer slept in the quarters. No announcement was made. No explanation offered. One evening she was called into the main house and did not return. By morning, her pallet had been cleared, her few belongings folded into a neat bundle and carried away by hands that did not ask questions. The other enslaved women noticed, of course. They always noticed. But noticing was not the same as speaking, and speaking was dangerous. Ruth was taken to the old carriage house. It stood just beyond the west wing, close enough to the main house to be watched, far enough to be forgotten. Its windows were narrow and high, built more for storage than comfort. Eleanor had it cleaned thoroughly, scrubbed floors, fresh bedding, a small stove brought in for winter. It was not kindness. It was preparation. You will stay here, Eleanor told her, standing in the doorway as Ruth took in the room. You will be brought food. You will work only when I say. You will not be seen. Yes, ma'am, Ruth replied because the words were expected. The arrangement unfolded with the precision of a business contract. Ruth was fed carefully, no spoiled food, no shortages. Eleanor insisted on fresh vegetables, clean water, milk when it was available. A doctor was summoned discreetly, told only that a servant required examination. He asked no questions that mattered and received no answers that were true. Thomas Whitcomb never came to the carriage house in daylight. When he did come, it was after the lamps were lowered, after the household had settled into sleep. Ruth heard his footsteps before she ever saw him, the measured pace of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He did not speak much. He did not explain. He did not apologize. Lie still, he said once curtly. Ruth turned her face away and fixed her gaze on the dark beam above her head, counting the cracks in the wood, telling herself that her body was no longer hers to feel. What happened during those nights did not need describing. The narrator would not linger there. It was enough to say that Ruth endured, and endurance left its mark. Eleanor waited outside each time. Sometimes she paced. Sometimes she sat, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the door as if daring it to open differently. She did not look at Thomas when he emerged. She looked at Ruth instead, assessing, measuring, searching for signs. "Are you well?" Eleanor asked once, her voice clipped. "Yes, ma'am." "You will rest tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am." Weeks passed. Ruth's body began to change. At first it was subtle, a heaviness, a nausea that rose in the mornings, a strange sensitivity to smells. Eleanor noticed everything. She kept her own calendar hidden beneath her mattress, marking dates with a careful hand. She compared Ruth's condition to her own staged illnesses, timing fainting spells and complaints so that servants would speak of her as delicate, weakened, indisposed. "I have not been myself," Eleanor told visiting ladies. "The doctor says it may be nerves." They clucked sympathetically, grateful it was not them. By late summer, there was no longer any doubt. The doctor confirmed it quietly in the carriage house. His brow creased as he pressed Ruth's abdomen. "How far along?" Eleanor demanded. "Perhaps 10 weeks, he said. "Maybe more." Eleanor dismissed him with a nod, already calculating backward. From that moment on, Ruth ceased to exist as a person in Eleanor's mind. She became a vessel, a timeline, a problem to be managed. Eleanor altered her own wardrobe, loosening stays, favoring flowing fabrics. She withdrew from society just enough to allow speculation but not suspicion. She let whispers grow and then smothered them with practiced smiles. "It has been such a strain," she said at church. "I fear I may be unwell." Meanwhile, Ruth's isolation deepened. She was not permitted outside except at night and only briefly. She spoke to no one but Eleanor and rarely Thomas. Even the servants who brought her food avoided her eyes, as if she carried a contagion more dangerous than fever. Ruth counted the days by the light that filtered through the high window. She pressed her hands against her belly, feeling the unfamiliar swell, the proof of something growing that would never be hers. Once she dared to speak. "Ma'am," she said as Eleanor inspected her, fingers cool and impersonal. "What gonna happen after?" Eleanor did not look up. "You will remain quiet." "And the baby?" "The baby will never know you." The word struck harder than any blow. Ruth swallowed. "It ain't right." Eleanor's head snapped up. "Do not say that again." Silence fell. What Ruth did not know, what she could not yet know, was that Eleanor had already planned the final act. She had decided where Ruth would go after the birth, what story would be told, how long she would be allowed to live within reach of the child she carried. By autumn, Eleanor began staging her own confinement. Curtains drawn. Meals taken upstairs. Rumors carefully fed. By winter, the house would speak of nothing but the miracle growing within its mistress. And in the carriage house, alone with the weight of a future that would be stolen from her the moment it arrived, Ruth lay awake at night, listening to the river move in the dark. It sounded to her like something being carried away, something that would never come back. By November, the lie had taken on a rhythm of its own. Ruth's belly rounded beneath the plain dresses Eleanor ordered for her, the fabric chosen not for comfort but concealment. The child moved often, restless and strong, a steady reminder of what was being taken shape by shape, breath by breath. Ruth learned to read those movements as one might read weather. When to brace, when to breathe through the ache, when to press her palm there and whisper words no one else would ever hear. "Easy," she murmured in the dark. "Easy now." In the main house, Eleanor practiced motherhood like a performance. She complained of fatigue at precisely the right moments. She allowed her appetite to falter when others watched. She staged faint spells that sent servants scrambling and gave Thomas reason to look concerned without ever asking questions. Dresses were altered again and again, not to fit a growing body but to suggest one. Cushions were placed carefully when she sat. Corsets were loosened in stages as though surrendering to necessity. At church, women leaned in to whisper, "Have you heard? After all these years." A miracle. Eleanor received their looks with lowered eyes and practiced humility. "I am grateful," she said, humbled. What they did not see was the nightly ritual in Eleanor's bedchamber, when she stood before the mirror and pressed her hands against her flat stomach, imagining weight where there was none, rehearsing the way she would one day cradle a child that was not born of her flesh. Down in the carriage house, Ruth grew quieter. Her body tired more easily now. Her ankles swelled by evening. The cold crept into her bones as winter settled along the river. Eleanor ordered extra blankets, thicker soups, a small fire to be kept going through the night. "You must not lose strength," Eleanor said, as if strength were a tool she owned. Ruth nodded. She conserved energy the way one conserved water in a drought. Time moved differently in confinement. Days stretched and folded in on themselves. Ruth marked them by Eleanor's visits, by the doctor's occasional examinations, by the way the baby shifted from flutter to firm presence beneath her ribs. Once, Eleanor lingered longer than usual. She stood near the window, watching Ruth with a look that was not quite hatred and not quite longing. Something sharper lived there. "You will deliver early," Eleanor said suddenly. Ruth looked up. "Early?" "I will not risk questions," Eleanor replied. "People already marvel too much." Ruth's throat tightened. "Is that safe?" Eleanor's eyes flicked to her cool. "It will be made safe." Made safe. Ruth wondered for whom. That night the child kicked so hard Ruth gasped. She pressed both hands to her belly, breath coming fast, fear rising like bile. She had heard stories, women whose bodies were pushed beyond what they could bear, whose pain was dismissed as inconvenience. She did not sleep. Above her, in the main house, Eleanor lay awake as well, listening to Thomas's breathing beside her. She thought of the nursery she had reopened at last, the dust wiped away, the cradle polished until it shone. She thought of names, of which family Bible the birth would be recorded in. She did not think of Ruth as a woman. By December, Eleanor withdrew completely. "Doctor's orders," she told anyone who asked. "I must rest." The household adjusted. Meals were taken upstairs. Curtains remained drawn. Servants spoke in hushed tones. Thomas played his part with quiet efficiency, fielding inquiries, dismissing concerns. "Everything is as it should be," he said. None of them knew how carefully Eleanor was timing everything. She counted weeks. She adjusted stories. She prepared the house for a birth that would not be seen. When the first pains came to Ruth, they were mistaken for cramps, dismissed as discomfort. But Eleanor noticed the way Ruth's breath shortened, the way her hand clenched the bedpost. "It is time," Eleanor said, her voice steady. A storm gathered that night, low and sudden. Thunder rolled across the fields. Rain struck the roof in sharp bursts. Eleanor sent the servants away, claiming nerves, fear, modesty. Only she and Ruth remained. What happened in that room would never be recorded. No ledger would mark it. No prayer would sanctify it. Ruth labored through the night, her cries muffled, her strength breaking and reforming in waves. Eleanor hovered, commanding, directing, refusing to let panic surface. "Push," Eleanor said. Again. When the child finally came, slick and crying, Eleanor took it immediately. Ruth reached out instinctively, a sound tearing from her chest that was half sob, half plea. "No," Eleanor said sharply. "Do not." The baby was wrapped, cleaned, carried away. Ruth lay back empty and shaking, staring at the ceiling beam she had memorized in the dark. In the main house, Eleanor emerged days later, pale and triumphant, a bundle in her arms. "A son," she announced. The plantation rejoiced. What Ruth did not know, what no one knew, was that the timing was not perfect. That a single detail, small and overlooked, had already begun to unravel the lie. And 15 years later, it would be that detail that destroyed everything. The child was presented to the world on a Tuesday morning, under clear skies that followed the storm like absolution. Church bells rang in Natchez. A messenger rode hard along the river road. Word reached neighboring plantations before noon. Eleanor Whitcomb had delivered a healthy boy. Mother and child were said to be resting. God had finally smiled upon Willowmere. Inside the carriage house, Ruth lay alone. Her body ached in places she could not name. Every breath felt borrowed. Milk came painfully into her breasts with nowhere to go, her body performing a duty it had not been allowed to complete. She turned her face into the pillow to muffle the sound she made, an animal sound raw and breaking. No one came for hours. When Eleanor finally returned, it was not with comfort. It was with instructions. "You will not speak of what happened," Eleanor said, standing at the foot of the bed. She looked altered now, thinner, paler, but sharpened by victory. "Not to anyone. Not ever." Ruth's voice was hoarse. "Let me see him." Eleanor's eyes flickered just once. Then they hardened. "No. I carried him," Ruth whispered. "Just once. He is not yours." The words landed with finality. Ruth turned her head away, tears soaking into the coarse pillowcase. Eleanor watched her for a moment longer, then turned and left, locking the door behind her. In the main house, the lie solidified. A wet nurse was brought in from another plantation, paid well, sworn to silence, told the child's mother was too weak to nurse. The nursery filled with the sounds Eleanor had once dreamed of, soft crying, murmured lullabies, the creak of the cradle. Thomas stood in the doorway that first night, watching Eleanor hold the child. "He looks strong," he said. "He is," Eleanor replied. "He must be." Thomas hesitated. "And the girl?" She will recover, Eleanor said. And then she will be moved. Thomas nodded, relief washing over his face as if Ruth's removal solved something deeper than inconvenience. He never asked where. Weeks passed. Ruth healed slowly. Her body did what it had always done, endured. Eleanor visited less often now, her attention fully consumed by the performance of motherhood. When she did come, it was with impatience. You will be sent to a property upriver, Eleanor said one afternoon. A place where no one knows you. Ruth stared at her. I ain't done nothing wrong. This is not punishment, Eleanor said again as if repetition could make it true. It is necessary. Ruth's hands clenched. He got my eyes. Eleanor stiffened. You will not say that. He got my eyes, Ruth repeated louder now. Same color. Same shape. Eleanor leaned in close, her voice deadly calm. You will forget what you think you see. And if you cannot, you will keep it buried so deep it rots. Silence followed, thick and dangerous. Ruth was moved at night. No farewell. No explanation to the quarters. She was placed on a wagon with 2 other enslaved people bound southward, her destination recorded as a transfer, nothing more. Willowmere exhaled as she disappeared down the road. Years passed. The boy, named Henry Whitcomb, grew tall and clever. He learned to ride before he learned to write. He favored the river over the fields, watching boats with a seriousness that amused his father. Eleanor hovered constantly, correcting his posture, his speech, his manners. He must never look common, she said. What Eleanor did not know was that children notice what adults refuse to see. Henry noticed how servants stared at him a moment too long. He noticed how one old woman crossed herself when he passed. He noticed how his reflection in dark glass did not resemble his mother's pale features as much as it resembled something else. Once at 12 he asked Eleanor directly, "Why do my eyes look different?" Eleanor smiled tightly. "You take after my grandmother." Henry accepted this because children are trained to. Ruth, meanwhile, lived out her days on a smaller plantation upriver. She never bore another child. She never spoke of Willowmere. She worked, aged, and eventually sickened. When she died, no record was sent back downriver. No one asked for one. By the time Henry turned 15, the secret had been buried under years of repetition and willful blindness. But secrets do not disappear. They wait. And the truth Ruth carried into the ground would find its way back to Willowmere, through blood, through timing, through a single question asked at the wrong moment. The lie had survived its birth. It would not survive its inheritance. By the time Henry Whitcomb reached his 15th year, Willowmere had come to regard him as inevitable. He moved through the house with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to exist there. Servants stepped aside without being told. Overseers waited for his opinion even when Thomas was present. The plantation had begun, subtly but unmistakably, to orient itself around him. Eleanor ensured it. She oversaw his education with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. Tutors were chosen carefully, men who emphasized Latin, scripture, arithmetic, and the polite restraint expected of a young heir. Every correction was immediate. Every flaw was addressed before it could take root. Sit straighter. Do not raise your voice. Whitcombs do not rush. Henry complied, though not always willingly. There was a restlessness in him that Eleanor could never quite discipline away. He preferred the river to the parlor, the open air to enclosed rooms. When lessons ended, he escaped outdoors, riding hard along the edge of the fields, watching the enslaved workers with a curiosity Eleanor disliked. "Do not linger there," she told him once sharply. "It is not proper." Henry frowned. "They look like me." The words landed wrong. Eleanor's breath caught, just for a moment. "They do not." Henry studied her face, sensing something unspoken. "Some of them do." "That is enough," Eleanor said. "You will not speak like that again." He did not argue. But he did not forget. Thomas noticed the tension but never named it. He had grown accustomed to not naming things. As Henry aged, Thomas retreated further into management and correspondence, leaving Eleanor to shape their son as she saw fit. At night, when the house settled and the lamps dimmed, Eleanor sometimes stood outside Henry's door and listened to him breathe. She told herself it was vigilance, protection. But beneath that was something sharper, fear. Because Henry was changing. His skin darkened in summer in a way hers never had. His eyes, those eyes, remained unmistakable. Servants whispered when they thought she could not hear. A few older ones avoided him altogether, their gazes heavy with recognition they dared not express. Once, Eleanor caught a housemaid staring at Henry with something like grief. "What are you looking at?" Eleanor snapped. The girl dropped her eyes immediately. Nothing, ma'am. Eleanor dismissed her the next morning. At 15, Henry was taken into the fields for the first time, not to work but to observe. Thomas believed it necessary, part of learning stewardship. Eleanor protested but was overruled. Henry rode alongside the overseer, listening, watching. He noticed how men flinched when spoken to sharply. He noticed how women lowered their eyes the way Ruth once had, though he did not remember Ruth by name, only as a presence from early childhood, a face that disappeared without explanation. "Where did the seamstress go?" he asked one evening abruptly. Eleanor's hand stilled on her embroidery. "Which one?" "The one who used to sit by the window." Eleanor did not look up. She was moved. Why? She was no longer needed. Henry's jaw tightened. "That don't seem right." Eleanor set her work aside carefully. "You will learn in time that not everything requires explanation." Henry held her gaze longer than she liked. "You always say that." The distance between them grew quietly after that. Henry began to ask questions. Not directly, not in ways that could be punished, but enough to unsettle. He studied records in his father's office. He listened too closely when elders spoke. He noticed dates, timings, inconsistencies small enough to be ignored but too numerous to dismiss. Eleanor noticed his noticing. She tightened control, limited his movements, corrected him publicly when necessary, reminded him, often, of what he owed her. "I gave you everything," she said once, her voice sharp with something like desperation. "Your name, your future, your place." Henry looked at her strangely. "I never asked for it." The words cut deeper than he intended. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the nursery long after Henry had gone to bed. She touched the cradle that had not been used in years, its wood smoothed by time. Her hands trembled. What she had taken she now feared losing. Because somewhere upriver, in an unmarked grave, lay a woman whose blood ran quietly through her son. And though Ruth was long gone, her presence lingered, in Henry's reflection, in his questions, in the way the truth strained against the walls Eleanor had built around it. None of them knew it yet, but the lie had reached its most dangerous stage. Not birth, not secrecy, but inheritance. And when the time came for Henry Whitcomb to claim what was his, the past would rise up and demand to be seen. By the spring of 1854, Eleanor Whitcomb had learned that control was not something one seized once and kept forever. It had to be renewed, enforced, fed. Henry was nearly grown now, his shoulders broadening, his voice settling into a register that no longer belonged to boyhood. He rode with confidence, spoke with certainty, and carried the Whitcomb name as though it were carved into his spine. To the outside world, the story had held. 15 years of repetition had hardened the lie into fact. Inside Willowmere, the strain showed. Eleanor managed it the way she managed everything, through proximity and pressure. She kept Henry close, involved him in household decisions, reminded him constantly of his obligations. When he spoke of travel, she discouraged it. When he mentioned New Orleans, she redirected him to Natchez. When he asked about marriage, she steered him toward families that asked fewer questions. "You must choose wisely," she said. "Bloodlines matter." Henry watched her then, the word blood hanging between them. "Do they?" Eleanor's lips thinned. "More than anything." Thomas's health declined that year. Long hours in the heat and years of quiet compromise had worn him thin. He coughed more, slept less. When he died suddenly in July, the plantation seemed to pause as if unsure who commanded it now. The answer came swiftly. Henry stood beside Eleanor at the funeral, dressed in black, composed. The will was read 3 days later. Land, slaves, accounts, all passed to him. Eleanor retained control of the house and certain trusts, but the future belonged to Henry Whitcomb. It was then that the whispers grew louder. An old overseer mentioned, carelessly, that the timing of Henry's birth had always been curious. A visiting cousin remarked on resemblance where there should have been none. A clerk in Natchez hesitated over dates in the parish registry, brow furrowed. Eleanor felt the ground shift. She summoned people more often now. Corrected records. Burned letters she had once believed safely hidden. She tightened her grip on Henry, reminding him of loyalty, of gratitude, of everything she had endured to bring him into the world. "I sacrificed for you," she said one night, her voice sharp with something near panic. Henry met her gaze steadily. "So did someone else." The words landed heavier than accusation. Eleanor stared at him. "What do you mean by that?" Henry hesitated. He had not meant to say it aloud. But once spoken, it demanded breath. "I hear things," he said, "from people who think I don't listen. Servants gossip. They don't all gossip the same lie. Silence spread between them, thick and dangerous. You are tired, Eleanor said finally. Your father's death has unsettled you. Henry did not argue. But the seed had broken soil. That summer, Henry rode upriver alone. He told Eleanor he wished to inspect one of the smaller properties. She agreed reluctantly, sending an escort partway before dismissing them. He arrived at a modest plantation by evening, asking questions under the pretense of business. An old woman there stared at him for a long moment before speaking. You got her eyes, she said softly. Henry felt the world tilt. Who? The woman crossed herself. Lord forgive me. What was her name? She shook her head, fear flooding her face. You best go. Henry returned to Willowmere at dawn, carrying more weight than answers. Eleanor knew the moment she saw him. The way his jaw set. The way his eyes avoided hers. What did you do? She demanded. Henry looked at her then, not as a son looks at a mother, but as a man looks at a mystery he is no longer willing to accept. I found a crack, he said quietly. And cracks spread. Eleanor's hands trembled. You will ruin everything. Henry's voice hardened. Or you did. What Eleanor did not know, what she could not have anticipated, was that a single document long forgotten had survived the fire she believed destroyed it. A record Ruth once made in secret. A date written in careful ink. By autumn it would surface. And when it did, 15 years of control would collapse in a matter of days. The document surfaced the way dangerous truths often did, not through force but through carelessness. It was discovered in Natchez, folded inside a ledger no one had opened in years, its pages yellowed and brittle from humidity and neglect. The clerk who found it did not understand its importance at first. It was only a notation, a date written in a smaller, neater hand than the rest. A birth. A name. A location upriver. The clerk frowned, tracing the ink with his finger. The date did not match the parish registry. It came too early. Or rather, the parish registry came too late. He closed the book, unsettled. By the time word reached Willowmere, it arrived already poisoned by curiosity. Henry was present when the messenger spoke, his tone careful, respectful. There is a discrepancy, sir. A record that does not align. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Records are often wrong, she said quickly, especially when written by men who did not know what they were doing. The messenger hesitated. This one is specific. Henry said nothing. He did not need to. The answer had already begun arranging itself in his mind, piece by piece, until it could no longer be ignored. That night, Henry went to Eleanor's room. She was seated at her vanity, brushing her hair with long, forceful strokes. She did not turn when he entered. You were not meant to see that, she said. Henry closed the door behind him. Was I meant to live a lie? Eleanor's hand stilled. Slowly she turned. I gave you everything, she said again, as if repetition could become truth. Without me, you would have had nothing. Henry stepped closer. You took something first. Eleanor's eyes hardened. You are ungrateful. I am asking who my mother was. The word cracked the room open. Eleanor stood abruptly. I am your mother. Henry shook his head. You raised me. You did not bear me. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Eleanor laughed then, sharp and brittle. This is madness. Henry reached into his coat and placed the folded paper on the vanity. Then explain this. Eleanor stared at the ink as if it might disappear if she willed it hard enough. Her chest tightened. Her breath shortened. You do not understand what you are destroying, she whispered. Henry's voice was steady. I think I finally do. Eleanor moved suddenly, grabbing the paper, tearing it in half, then again, her movements frantic. It means nothing, she said. Nothing. Henry watched the pieces fall to the floor. It means everything. The confrontation did not end with shouting. It ended with something colder. Eleanor's face settled into calculation. If you pursue this, she said quietly, you will lose more than answers. You will lose your inheritance. Your standing. Everything you believe is yours. Henry met her gaze. Then it was never mine to begin with. That was when Eleanor realized she had miscalculated. She had believed control was permanent. That gratitude could be engineered. That silence, once enforced long enough, became loyalty. She was wrong. Within days, Henry requested a full review of plantation records. Eleanor protested. Henry overruled her. Clerks came. Documents were examined. Dates compared. Whispers turned into cautious conversations. Eleanor moved quickly. She summoned an old doctor. One who remembered the birth, who remembered being told what to say. She reminded him of favors owed. He hesitated, then agreed to affirm the official story. But the damage was done, because someone else had spoken. A woman from upriver, old and bent, arrived unannounced at Willowmere one afternoon. She asked to see Henry. Eleanor tried to send her away. She is nothing, Eleanor said sharply. She is confused. The woman's voice trembled but did not break. I buried her. Henry turned to her. Who? Ruth, the woman said. Your mother. The word hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt something inside her fracture. The woman continued, eyes fixed on Henry. She cried for you till she couldn't no more. She said you'd come asking one day. Henry swallowed hard. Why didn't anyone say anything? The woman looked at Eleanor then. Because fear lasts longer than grief. Eleanor backed away, her control unraveling in real time. This is a lie, she said, though her voice no longer convinced even herself. Henry did not respond. He stood very still, absorbing a truth that rearranged his entire life. That evening, Eleanor locked herself in her room. By morning, the plantation knew. What Eleanor had tried to bury for 15 years had surfaced not through force or rebellion, but through memory, fragile, persistent, and finally unstoppable. The lie was no longer private, and what followed would leave Willowmere changed forever. The night the truth finished its slow work, the house did not sleep. Candles burned low in rooms where no one sat. Doors were closed that had not been closed in years. Even the river seemed quieter, its constant movement muted, as though it too were listening. Eleanor Whitcomb remained locked inside her bedchamber until after midnight. She sat at the edge of the bed, hands folded so tightly her fingers ached, staring at the door as if it might accuse her if it opened. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the creak of wood settling, the distant cough of a servant, the wind pressing briefly against the shutters. She had always believed that fear was something she inspired in others. Now it lived in her. When the knock finally came, it was not loud. It did not need to be. Come in, she said, her voice thinner than she intended. Henry entered alone. He closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch echoing like a verdict. He did not sit. He did not pace. He stood in the center of the room, his posture straight, his face unreadable. You spoke to her, Eleanor said. Yes. You believe her? I believe what makes sense. Eleanor rose slowly. I protected you. Henry's eyes met hers. You erased her. Silence stretched between them. Eleanor took a step forward. You do not understand what that woman's life would have meant for you. What it would have done to your name. My name, Henry said quietly, is the only thing she never had. Eleanor's composure fractured then, just slightly. She would have ruined you, Eleanor said, her voice sharp with panic now. She would have claimed you. Dragged you into her world. She was already my world, Henry replied. You just hid it from me. Eleanor shook her head. You were mine. No, Henry said. I was stolen. The word struck her harder than any blow. Eleanor felt the room tilt. She reached for the bedpost to steady herself. If you tell people this, she said, lowering her voice, everything will be taken from you. Henry did not move. It already was. Eleanor's breath came faster. You think the world will welcome you if this comes out? You think they will see you as anything but a problem to be solved? Henry's jaw tightened. Then let them see me. Eleanor stared at him, really stared, and for the first time allowed herself to see Ruth in his face. Not just the eyes but the set of his mouth, the quiet strength in his stillness. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I had no choice. Henry shook his head slowly. You had power. That was your choice. Something in Eleanor broke. She crossed the room suddenly, grasping his sleeve, nails biting into fabric. I made you, she hissed. Without me, you would not exist as you are. Henry gently but firmly pulled his arm free. Without her, I would not exist at all. The words ended it. Eleanor stepped back, her strength gone. She sank onto the chair beside the vanity, her reflection staring back at her. Older now, smaller, stripped of the certainty she had worn like armor. What will you do? She asked. Henry did not answer immediately. He looked around the room, the furniture, the drapes, the walls that had absorbed 15 years of secrets. I will tell the truth, he said finally. Not all of it. Not publicly. Eleanor looked up sharply. Then what? I will change the records that still can be changed, Henry continued. I will free the people she left behind. I will set aside land. I will not let this house pretend it was built clean. Eleanor's lips trembled. And me? Henry met her gaze. You will live with what you did. The cruelty of it was precise. Eleanor nodded slowly. She had always feared exposure. She had never considered survival without absolution. Henry turned to leave. At the door he paused. She named me once, he said without looking back. Did you know that? Eleanor closed her eyes. No, she whispered. Henry opened the door and left her alone with the mirror. By dawn, Eleanor Whitcomb was a woman undone. Not by law, not by violence, but by the one thing she could never control. The truth. And Willowmere, long propped up by silence, began the slow, irreversible work of reckoning. The reckoning did not arrive with shouting or spectacle. It came the way rot does, quietly from the inside out. Within weeks of Thomas Whitcomb's death, Henry began altering the machinery of Willowmere with deliberate care. He did not announce changes. He enacted them. Orders were given in calm tones. Documents were requested. Ledgers were corrected where correction was still possible and annotated where it was not. Some records were left untouched on purpose. Henry understood something Eleanor never had, that erasing the past only gave it power. So he allowed certain inconsistencies to remain, dates that did not align, transfers that made little sense, margins marked with unfamiliar handwriting. They became a kind of quiet testimony, visible only to those who knew how to read between lines. The official story did not change. Publicly, Eleanor Whitcomb remained Henry's mother. The parish registry still bore her name beside his birth. Natchez society, relieved to avoid discomfort, accepted the version that required the least imagination. But inside Willowmere, everything shifted. Henry freed 6 enslaved people within the year, citing personal debts owed by the estate. Land upriver was quietly deeded to 2 families who had once belonged to the property where Ruth had died. No explanation was offered. No ceremony held. Eleanor watched it happen from a distance. She remained in the house, her authority diminished but not publicly revoked. Guests still addressed her as mistress. Servants still answered her requests. But something essential had been removed. People no longer looked to her for permission. She spent more time alone now, confined to rooms she once ruled. The nursery remained closed. The mirror in her bedchamber reflected a woman she barely recognized, thin, sharp-eyed, haunted by the absence of noise she once commanded. At night she dreamed of Ruth. Not as she had known her, quiet, obedient, but as a woman standing upright, watching. Saying nothing. Waiting. Henry did not visit her often. When he did, their conversations were brief and formal, stripped of the old intimacy that had never truly existed. He spoke to her as one speaks to a relative whose role is fixed but distant. "You will want to sign this," he said once, placing a document before her. She did. Her hand shook. Eleanor began to understand what punishment truly was. Not exposure. Not ruin. But irrelevance. Years later, historians would debate Willowmere's records. They would note the odd timing of a birth following 14 barren years. They would question the sudden relocation of a seamstress whose name appeared only briefly, then vanished. They would argue whether the whispers were credible or merely the inventions of guilt projected backward. Some would dismiss it all as rumor. Others would linger on the margins. But no official account would ever name Ruth as Henry Whitcomb's mother. That truth lived elsewhere. It lived in the land Henry set aside but never named. In the freed families who spoke her name only in private. In the quiet insistence with which Henry refused to pretend his inheritance was untouched by blood. Eleanor died 10 years after Thomas, in the same house she had once ruled without question. Her passing was marked properly. Notices were sent. A stone was placed in the family plot. The inscription named her as wife and mother. Nothing more. Henry stood at the burial, his expression unreadable. He did not cry. He did not pray. He watched the earth cover the casket and felt nothing like closure. Because some stories do not end with burial. They end with absence. And the absence Ruth left behind, the child taken, the life erased, the truth suppressed, had shaped Willowmere more profoundly than Eleanor's name ever would. By the time Henry himself grew old, the plantation no longer resembled the one Eleanor had engineered. Fewer fields. Fewer chains. More space given to silence and memory. Whether that was justice or simply the quiet rearrangement of guilt, no one could say for certain. But one thing was undeniable. The record said one thing. The blood said another. And between the two lay a truth that had survived 15 years of secrecy, only to surface when control finally failed. By the time Henry Whitcomb reached old age, Willowmere Plantation existed more as memory than monument. The great house still stood, its columns weathered, its paint dulled by decades of sun and rain, but the certainty that once lived inside its walls was gone. Fields that had once stretched endlessly now lay fallow or divided. The river still moved as it always had, indifferent to names, bloodlines, and bargains made in the dark. Henry lived out his later years quietly. He never married. Not because he could not, but because he would not. The question of lineage, of what was inherited, of what was owed, had hollowed something in him that never fully healed. He sponsored schools for freed children upriver. He endowed a small church on land that had once belonged to Willowmere. He paid wages where chains had once been counted as assets. People called him generous. Some called him strange. A few who remembered whispers from long ago called him haunted. He never corrected them. In his study, Henry kept a small wooden box locked inside a drawer. It contained no deeds, no money, no jewelry. Only a scrap of paper, browned with age, bearing a single name written in careful ink. He had found it years after Eleanor's death, hidden behind a loose board in the carriage house that had long since collapsed. A name, a date, nothing more. It was enough. When Henry died, there was no scandal, no contest over his will, no sudden revelations published in newspapers. Willowmere passed into other hands, then other hands still. The land was broken up, sold, repurposed. Time did what Eleanor never could. It erased the illusion of permanence. Years later, decades later, historians studying Natchez records would occasionally pause over Willowmere. They would note the oddities, the discrepancies, the sudden transfers of land without explanation. The seamstress whose name appeared once, then vanished entirely. Some would speculate. Most would move on. Because history favors what is written boldly, not what survives quietly in the margins. Whether Ruth's story was ever fully recovered did not matter as much as the fact that it endured at all. It lived in rumor, in altered paths, in a man who refused to pretend his life had begun cleanly. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling truth of all. That the greatest violence of that era was not always chains or whips or bloodshed in the open. Sometimes it was a woman who wanted a child badly enough to steal one. A society willing to accept a miracle without asking who paid for it. And a system where survival itself required silence. Willowmere's secret did not destroy it in fire or rebellion. It hollowed it out from within. And long after the names on the stones faded, the truth remained, unofficial, uncomfortable, and impossible to fully bury. Because blood remembers, even when records lie. What do you think of this story? Was Eleanor Whitcomb a victim of her time, or an architect of cruelty who hid behind respectability? Was Henry's quiet reckoning enough, or did justice require more? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark historical mystery and want more stories that blur the line between documented history and buried horror, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. And share this video with someone who believes history still has secrets worth uncovering. These stories were buried on purpose. These voices were silenced deliberately. We tell them so they are not forgotten.